Welcome to season 2 of the Happy Sensory Corner podcast. At Mendability, those of you who have been following us, you now know that our mission is to help everyone, especially when they are vulnerable, to feel happy, more comfortable in their own skin, more confident, proud of themselves, so they can be their true selves, and we can all journey together through life more happily. Our contribution is to work on brain health. And as our brains grow stronger and faster and healthier and all of that good stuff, all of us benefit. But we're thinking especially about those among us who maybe struggle with sleep or anxiety or overwhelmed by the barrage of information from the environment. And so we developed a gentle, family-centered program of whole brain games that boosts brain development and activates the brain's self-healing mechanisms. It's based on a neuroscience field of environmental enrichment. We call it sensory enrichment. So while we're experts in brain development, you may say, we know that there is so much more that parents have to navigate, especially when it comes to securing the right educational support for the children. Understanding IEPs, special education services, how to advocate for the resources your child needs can feel overwhelming. Parents often left to figure it all out on their own. And the system isn't always straightforward or easy to navigate. And we're going to stay politically correct at this point of the conversation, but I understand that when we talk about a system that isn't straightforward and easy to navigate today, as some interesting changes have happened in the education system that we probably will talk about. But anyway, so that's why I'm really excited to have today's guest with us, Christopher Wyatt. Christopher brings both personal and professional expertise to this conversation. As an autistic father raising neurodiverse children, he knows firsthand the challenges of navigating the education system, advocating for support, ensuring the children get the resources they need to thrive. And he's also spent years researching, writing, publishing, speaking on these topics, consulting. And so, but let me formally introduce him. Christopher Wyatt. Like I said, research. Oh, sorry. I was going to give your bio, but yes, it's lovely to have you, Christopher.
Sorry about that. But thank you for the opportunity. Yes.
Of course. So this is the part where I'm going to boost your ego a little bit there. So we were talking about research, education, and advocacy. I want to mention that you come with all of the paperwork to lend credibility to everything you're about to say. A PhD from the University of Minnesota. How many papers have you published so far?
Ooh, I don't know. I would have to think about it. In recent years, I believe about a dozen book chapters or formal papers in journals. But before that, obviously lots and lots of writing in general media as well.
So I wanted to make sure that parents who are listening and also the special education directors who are listening and also the health professionals who are listening understand that this is going to be a very valuable conversation. But before we get a little, maybe not dry, but deep into the subject of special education, I wanted to give our audience a chance to connect with you on a personal level, and so I wondered if you could share with us, did something, and it's a question I like to ask to everybody, did something happen to little Christopher that planted the seed for where you're at today?
I think the primary reason that I went into education was, I don't want to call it being bitter or angry, but it was frustration. I had an educator tell me that I was never going to be anything, told my parents I was not going to go to college. I was not destined for anything great or wonderful. And that really stuck with me, hearing teachers tell my parents that I wasn't going to do anything, that I wasn't capable of it because of my physical and neurological differences. And I don't know what you would call it, but there's that part of me that says I want to prove them wrong. There's that tenacity that comes through that if someone says I can't or shouldn't do something, then I'm going to try to do it. I may not do it the best. I may not be the only that can do it. But when someone said, well, you're not going off to college or anything like that, I was like, well, yeah, I can become an educator. I can do this better. In fact, a lot of what I experienced as a student is why I wanted to change the system. The system, when I was growing up in the 1980s, was not very inclusive. It still isn't. I'm learning, but I wanted to be a factor for change and prove that I could become not just an educator, but someone who studied how to do it better than what I was hearing from those people around me who had a lot of power. Teachers forget they are very influential. So when a teacher is telling a parent, your child isn't going to be anything, and the child can hear that, that can be very damaging. Now, the child can be like me and just like obstinate. Sorry, I'm going to become a teacher and I'm going to change this system. Or the child, like most children, they hear it so often, they just give up. So those who are told that they lack certain skills or lack self-control or that they're too sensitive and they need to control themselves better, self-regulate better. I think if you hear something often enough, it becomes self-fulfilling because you internalize it and you echo those negative voices. So for me, it was more, tell me something negative and I'll prove you wrong. But I know that that's not the norm. I know that.
And when you were saying that's not, and then you pause for a split second, I thought you said this is not what your research has said is the solution. Is
Yeah.
it? Is a degree of rebellion a, a, a fruitful spirit in which to be an advocate or conduct research or educate other people? Is this what you've seen in your research?
Obviously not. It's so sad, right? There's this idea that a good teacher or a good coach, especially when you take a look at the 1970s or the 60s, the idea that the coach yells and screams at the team to be better, somehow insulting your kids. Well, gee, a turtle could run faster than you guys. Why can't you catch the ball? Um, a lot of stereotypical language that you hear, in movies with coaches
Mm,
of sports. And yet research has shown that the actual more effective approach, even in sports coaching, sports psychology, is to reward the positive. Because when you tell someone what they're doing wrong, then they become paralyzed by fear of doing that thing wrong. So they stop taking risks, they stop trying, they do what's safe so they don't get yelled at. So if you're working with a player, one of the research studies I read had batting coaches for baseball. So the batting coach found that when they were telling players what they were doing right, the players did that more often, so they got more hits. When they focused on what was wrong, the players would just freeze at the plate and not know what to do. Now, I know not all of our listeners are going to be familiar with American baseball. Maybe they know cricket or something, but if you tell someone what you're doing wrong, then they just worry about making that mistake. But if you say, wow, I really like how you're standing at the plate, or I really like how you're handling the pitch. Praise is what people then seek out. You give someone praise, they want more of it. So it turns out that the right way for most people is to offer the praise, and then what they will do is try to keep earning that praise. You keep giving someone negative, and they're just going to try to avoid the negative. And I think
uh,
that that's
mm,
unfortunately where a lot of parents and teachers trip up is they go with the negative. Why didn't you clean your room? Or why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing your homework? We don't say, wow, today you did this really well, and I want to see more of that. But research is showing that that's the more effective way to deal with with students, especially those who are neurodiverse, because they're very literal. We tend to be very black and white. And so you tell us what we're doing wrong and that there's a consequence, we're going to freeze up and that's going to be always on our mind. We're going to obsess about staying out of trouble.
And then the next thing that happens is you end up in trouble because that's what's in your mind.
Yeah, and it becomes a self-fulfilling loop. So our education, oh, I I say and again, this is cultural, but in our culture, we focus too much on red marks. The old red pen marking up the paper or the computer score in red. We focus on taking away points and telling people what's wrong. We don't say, wow, I really like that second paragraph of that essay, or I really love the way that you presented this science material, or that you talked about this event in history. Instead, we say, well, gee, your opening paragraph was poor. The science you didn't quite get everything right in this paper. Yeah, so we focus on the negative, thinking, well, correcting people will make them better, instead of realizing that this has to be accompanied with enough praise that someone seeks out doing the right thing. But that's not how we approach often not just teaching, but sometimes parenting. We just don't realize that all that negativity is a feedback loop for the brain.
I that reminds me of another study, and I wondered if you could comment on that because it almost looks like when you look at it on the surface that it contradicts what you're saying, and I think there's going to be something deep coming up, and it was a study with firefighters where they one group of them they showed them this is what the good firefighters did and they successfully put it out and saved everybody, and then they had this other group where they said these are all the mistakes that people did, and it seemed that by experiencing in virtual reality, because it was a virtual reality thing, by experiencing virtual reality, the mistakes that the firefighter had done, that the second group that were learning from the other people's mistakes were more did a better job at their job at fighting fire. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's important to know what you can improve, but I think that when we are dealing with adults who are hopefully fully formed, they're already training to be firefighters, that they now understand that I want to be the best firefighter I can be. I want to save lives. I want to save property. So I think that there is something that comes along with maturity, in recognizing the mistakes you made or the mistakes you want to avoid. I think there is also a self-preservation aspect. I don't know particularly what the training was, but if you show me that something's going to hurt me, I definitely will avoid that. So I think that's also valuable. But I'm not dealing with life and death, and I'm not dealing with fully realized adults. I'm dealing with children and teenagers, young adults at the university level. But yeah, I do think it's really important to understand that showing someone the negatives and the negative outcomes can be useful. We certainly want to tell children, look at what happens if you play with matches, or look at what happens if you do something wrong in the kitchen. We want to explain danger so they avoid danger. And I think we're very good at being risk averse. The human brain, as I said, they don't want to get yelled at. You don't want the negative consequence. We're very good at avoiding the negative. And in firefighting, I'm sure that avoiding the negative consequence has a lot of value.
Yeah, and I also think the major difference between the two situations, a child being told he's not going to do it, and a child being shown a kid who didn't do it, it's they weren't told they were not going to do it. They were shown the negative consequences of poor choices, but they were out. It wasn't them. There were no fingers being pointed at them, and that's a whole different ballgame, I imagine.
I would think so. And that's a difficult thing for me to consider because the idea of watching someone else and then, okay, they got in trouble. I don't want to get in trouble. But I can see how that would be effective in training. The I think the thing that I like to about the human brain and the way we learn is that we learn by doing. And so watching someone else, we might say, okay, I'm going to avoid that. But what we really learn from is when we do the thing right and get the praise. So I think it's good to have the exposure to what not to do, but I think the real final lesson that where it ingrains in you is when you do it right and someone says, wow, good job. I don't think we ever want to avoid teaching someone what's dangerous or what not to do or how to better do their job and the consequences of poor decisions. But I think we're all wired to chase dopamine highs. We're all wired to chase adrenaline for whatever reason. And I think that praise is key. So avoiding mistakes, I would imagine once that firefighter sees those mistakes, that they're aiming to get the praise of doing it right.
I love it, and I think the two combined brought us to a deeper place than the usual cliches, and I love this. And so it makes me want to know even more about some of the depths you've plumbed with your grant-funded research. What's the most surprising piece of data that you've discovered?
I think for me, the thing that stands out most is that neurodiversity is, by definition, diversity. And so we can't design a classroom that is perfect for autistics or perfect for someone with a learning disability. We cannot do it. And so what's surprising is how important it is to give agency to the student or to the customer, the client, the employee, whoever it is who happens to be um, different neurologically. So, for example, my two daughters. My oldest plays in a band. Right? She plays keyboard, she plays drums, she plays bass guitar, she does concerts, she loves it. She's very autistic, and it's very obvious she's autistic. She speaks in the flat monotone. When the concert's over, she walks off the stage, not always even remembering to thank anybody, but she's excellent on stage. She thrives. My youngest can't be in the loud environment, the loud music, the noise, the people. She she cannot handle. Her sensory overload is a dominant feature of her diversity. So we can't say here is a perfect situation for autistics because that situation changes. The saying, if you know one person, one autistic, you know one autistic, you know one person. And that's so true. So we can't really say, here's a list of ideal situations for teaching. So what my research found when I was doing the grant-funded work at the University of Minnesota was that the most effective classrooms were the online or physical spaces that allowed the student to make adjustments. And that can be as simple as letting someone choose a part of the room that isn't as lit, isn't as bright. It can be allowing students to bring in headphones if they need to block out noise, or maybe not. It can be that they need larger fonts and more contrast on their computer screen. I can't predict what any other autistic person is going to want or need. I can predict some basics. They want clear rules, they want clear standards, concrete instruction, firm deadlines, but I cannot predict their sensory needs. I cannot predict how their body is going to react to stimuli, and only they can, and I need to listen to them. So as a teacher, um, I want to define a really great classroom, and yet my research is telling me there is no single great classroom. It's like, oh darn. You can't just put all the seats in a row and have dim lights and soothing music or whatever it is. That may not work. It may be that some students want a bright room, some want a dim, some want bright animation on their computer screen. Some people don't want any animation on their computer screen. So that's that's something that goes against a lot of what we have been doing, especially with the neurodiverse, because as part of the mandates and regulation in the United States and elsewhere, we get checklists. Oh, well, you have an autistic student. You need to do X, Y, and Z in your classroom. Well, what if it turns out that X, Y, and Z don't work for that person? One of the checklist things is these noise canceling headphones. And yet I know autistic children and I've met autistic adults who cannot wear headphones. They don't like
Hmm.
the
The
feeling.
pressure, the thing. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So I've got a checklist and the checklist is wrong. You
So what
cannot.
you, okay. So there's a couple of different, I've got lots of follow-up questions. I guess where I want to go next is this idea that what you're helping neurodiverse people is going to benefit all of us. This idea of giving students agency, I that sounds like something that would be fantastic to apply in any classroom, in any environment. So, have you seen examples where your research being successfully implemented in a special education environment also benefited other students
Oh,
or
definitely.
work environments?
Definitely, in terms of the university classrooms where we have a large number of students seeking services, or at least we did. Um, so even long before COVID, before the pandemic, what I found was that because learning styles are so different, learning preferences are so different, memory works in different ways. What I did was I would always have my lecture notes online. I would have my recordings online. I would obviously deliver the course material in class in front of the students and take their questions. But this multimodal approach of having things as a script, as an audio file, as a video file, in-person delivery, a lot of my colleagues were thinking, this is insanity. You're doing all this work, and for what? A third of your students or a quarter of your students are with disability services. What about, the three quarters? You're sure spending a lot of time on. But then what happened was I had a student come to me who was a student athlete, and he said, Dr. Wyatt, while I'm at the gym, I'm listening to your lecture again, and it's really helping me. And I never thought about that before, but I can listen to it, I can skip forward, I can go back and hear something that I didn't get. And wow, this is the best way I've ever had a professor deliver something. And at the time it was just I was doing it because I thought it's going to help those students that I have to fill out a form that logs how I'm doing the accommodations for those students from disability services. But I had other students coming to me and saying, wow, I download the notes that we had in class. I like to take my own notes, but then when I download your notes and read them and compare them to mine, I find new things that I should have highlighted or things that. So I had students who were not diagnosed with any neurological condition per se, but neurodiversity means we are all different. Our brains are all different, and you don't need a label to thinking your unique way. So that athlete who loved the audio, the other person who loved downloading the notes and rereading them, giving students those accommodations, those ways of accessing information proved beneficial to everybody. If you missed a class, you knew you could download it. If you were really engaged in the conversation, but maybe you didn't take notes because you were too busy actually engaging, then you know that the notes are going to be there on my website for that course. So what I found and what I've written about was how these multimodal approaches, they seem like a lot of work up front when you're preparing a course, but most of us who teach at the university level and many teachers in elementary and high school, secondary, post-secondary, we teach the same courses 2 or 3 times a year, or we teach them year after year in some cases. So if I record my lectures or do my notes once, they're then done for the next 2, 3, 5 classes of that particular topic. And uh, it's not a lot of work at that point. And then when COVID hit, all of my colleagues were like, oh my gosh, how am I going to move my course online? And I'm thinking, mine's already online. I'm done. Okay, there's a pandemic. Oh well. And we can laugh about it now these years later, but it sure saved a lot of time and energy for me and my students. It was a nice, easy transition. And they're like, wow, Dr. Wyatt, you really spent some time preparing for the pandemic. It's like, no, this is how I've always done my course. It's just we lost the meeting in person. And I regret that we lost the meeting in person, but we still had the podcast. We still had the video recordings. We still had the lecture notes. And we still had Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever the university was using. So we didn't lose as much because I had already tried to accommodate neurodiversity, and it turned out that everyone was like, wow, this is great. And so writing about those experiences over the last few years, I've noted that others who have adopted my approach were also prepared for the pandemic, or they have also been prepared for even something as simple as a weather shutdown for 2 weeks. You know, as you know, places where it snows or you get, bad weather of any kind, you might have to close for a day or two. Um, that ability to just say, hey, everything is still online. When you get back online, you can check, we can catch up. We're not going to lose time or we're not going to lose content from our course. Employers can do the same thing. Employers can let people work via audio, via, we're here on the Zoom session. This idea that everyone has to work in the same cubicle in the same way, businesses that are experimenting still and being more open with that. I'm thinking here in the US of REI is one that's doing it, an outdoor company. Companies that are treating their employees, as they say, like adults, and I agree with that so much. They are treating their employees as responsible humans who can make good decisions and work at home if they need or work in the office as they need. Let people find how they are most comfortable, where their brains are most productive, where they feel most secure, and they will thrive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, why why so much resistance? I mean, the first instinct of some of your colleagues was, oh, well, you're spending so much time on the 25%. What about the 75% that are left behind? This comment is like a natural reaction we hear a lot. There's resistance to learning how to accommodate the people who are more obviously suffering from the lack of accommodations, but that's benefiting from all the people who are been suffering from the same lack of accommodations, but have been maybe were more resilient or maybe more flexible, but ultimately benefited from that, from those options. So where is it coming from? Because I'm trying to understand, politically now in the U.S. Accommodating for anything is now seen as a cardinal sin that needs to be purged from the system as a fraud. And I feel like some of that comes from the same fear that you experience as that natural reaction from your colleagues. And do you know where it's coming from? I'd love to understand better.
We see a lot of difficulty obtaining accommodations globally. I've done work with individuals in Australia, France, Ireland, uh, the UK, Canada, and I don't like the phrases neurotypical and neurodivergent. I think brains are all brains, and that's why I use more neurodiversity in general. Every brain is different, but there are some common traits we see in people in leadership. People in leadership tend to be extroverts. It makes sense. They're connectors. They're connectors. They build a social network, and they have certain traits that they value. And what happens is they think that those traits, those soft skills, as we call them in the United States, are so important that anyone who doesn't possess those same skills in that same way is somehow not capable of leadership or creativity or whatever it is, and we get dismissed. Um, and it's really frustrating. But I point out that if you take a look at the leadership in the United States, most of our leaders go to two universities. If you look at our Supreme Court, they go to Harvard and Yale. If you take a look at the UK, Cambridge and Oxford. If you take a look at France, there are two universities that really dominate the technocratic leadership class in France. And unfortunately, um, those universities, one of the great statistics about billionaires in the US was it wasn't whether or not you graduated from Harvard, it was did you get in? Obviously a Harvard dropout still does well. We see that repeatedly. They become billionaires. It is the traits that get you into those things. Well, think about it. It's doing an interview well, right? They interview their candidates because they're small schools, they're elite. It's how you dress. Do you give the signals of social standing? Do you know how to wear the right tie, wear the right colors, talk about the right things? Did you pad your resume with the right social activities? And so when they judge each other, they're judging each other on these criteria. that are inadvertently, I don't think they see this as hateful or as classist or anything else. They keep talking about merit. We're all about merit. But what they don't realize is that their model of merit is based on being like them. And so, oh, are you a good public speaker? Can you do an interview well? Did you belong to these clubs? Did you, can you go to a Rotary Club and speak, or a Sir Optimist International, or, can you be on your debate club? Were you on your debate club, your mock UN, whatever it was at your university level? And it's just the sad reality is that we are judging people by a standard that's better suited for salesmanship and politics than anything else. Um, I don't care if my doctor is particularly good at debating. I just don't. I don't care if my doctor is really great at joining a bunch of people for beers and watching ice hockey. I don't care. Is he a good doctor? But we judge university admissions, not just in the US, but in most places, on interviews, on an admissions essay, tell us about yourself. And they all want the same thing, how I overcame something, oh, what was me? And this was, look at here I am now at your university door. Um, and ironically, they get a whole bunch of white guys who are upper middle class. So I don't know what their struggles were. Um, so their filters are very strange to me. But those filters are how they judge normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets encoded. Now, I don't know if we can say it gets encoded in the law directly because they say it's all about merit. But what is that merit? What is it that they're judging? It concerns me greatly because as an autistic individual, I'm very sensitive to texture. In fact, I was complaining to my wife about this shirt, which is a T-shirt, and I'm complaining about, oh my gosh, the seams itch. It's driving me nuts. And she's like, yeah, the whole suit and tie thing just doesn't really work very often for you, does it? No, I'm complaining about a T-shirt, and when I have to teach, I've got to put on a suit and tie and jacket, and I'm miserable for, 8 hours. And it's very hard. But I'm judged on that. If I can put on that tie and I can fight all that sensory overload and I can hide or mask, we call it masking, right? If I can put on the mask and be the good business person in the suit, then I can do my job better apparently because I can wear the right tie and the right shirt. So there are lots of things that become gatekeeping. Um, as where say the student who lives in public housing um, and wasn't able to get tutoring, private tutors or anything like that, and maybe they don't have perfect French or perfect English or perfect German because they were immigrants, but they're brilliant. But we're going to judge them on all these little standards that are disguised as merit. That's really my argument, is that we disguise a culturally created standard as merit. And what happens is unfortunate, but all you do is you look at who's in charge of even the companies that claim that they embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. That, and you look at the heads of the companies, and largely the Fortune 500 are still men over 50, and largely white men over 50, with a few exceptions, but merit. But what do they really mean? They mean, can you talk like me? Can you dress like me? Do you sound like me? Did you go to the schools that I went to? And we disguise it by calling it merit. Um, it's frustrating because I don't know how to prepare autistic individuals, or anyone with any form of difference to compete in that market. It's a difficult thing to do.
So let's look at the rising generation and let's look at the parents who have an opportunity. Where do you where would you like those parents to focus their energy when they advocate, when they maybe advocacy is still leading the witness. Where do you think the parents should focus their energy in preparing their neurodiverse children for the real world?
I strongly believe that everything begins, and I think every bit of neuropsychology, biology points to this, The human brain does most of its development before the age of 12. We really have to advocate for our children when they are young, when they are at their youngest. And we can do this as parents or as educators, as politicians, as experts in any field. We need to explain to people that young brains need as much information as possible. It strikes me as absurd. I'm in the United States, and it strikes me as completely absurd that we teach second language in the secondary level instead of when a child is 5 or 6. What? The human brain, you watch any child, if you have lived in multiple nations when your child is 4, 5, 6, the child picks up the language like that. They just do. Our brain is wired for language. Um, we can argue whether you're with Chomsky or Steven Pinker on this, but either way, they both agree the human brain is wired to communicate, and we learn language wherever we are. We learn the language, and children learn it faster. So what do? We teach it in our high schools and colleges in the U.S. when it's most difficult to learn it. And so I argue that we really should invest more in teaching children under 12 because that's when the brain can catch up. A child who fell behind during COVID has a much better chance catching up still when they're 7, 8, 9 than they do when they're 17, 18, 19. We really need to be focusing on young education. We need to do that in all of our countries throughout the developed world and everywhere in the world, really. Our children have their have brains that want to learn. The child brain is a sponge, and that child brain wants information. It absorbs it and then decides what is or isn't important, and then gets ready to prune as it decides what it needs to keep and not keep. That's the brain we need to nurture. I argue that, yes, I'm a university instructor, and I will talk to you about IEPs and 504s in the United States, or individualized education programs in the UK, or the approach that Canada has, which varies by province slightly. But in the end, by the time they get to my classroom, it's too late. Someone with bad study habits at 20, that's a tough change. I mean, it can happen. It can. People can say, wow, I'm a 20-year-old and I'm realizing now I need to study better. But the time we really should have been addressing those things is when the child was in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, not the university. The university is a hard place to catch up.
I want to end on a peak, on a high, and I feel like could you share with us a story or an example of an education setting around youth, 5, 6 year olds, that made a change to the way they do things and what happened?
Well, I've got to say, I'm full of praise for a group here in the United States, and they are global, but the Girl Scouts. So the Girl Scouts noticed that a lot of STEM education was being cut, or they were focused more in the public schools from the United States on boys. So what Girl Scouts did was they started creating STEM training and robotics summer camps and robotics teams for the girls. And by doing that at these young ages, because Girl Scouts, you're dealing with 6, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, all the way up into secondary school, but showing them other women building robots, talking to them about astronauts who were women, talking to them about scientists who were women. You can bring in so many great names. Obviously, you can go to history and talk about Curie, or you can talk about astronauts and talk about Jameson. But there are all these things you can do. I like to point out to people today. We're talking about the computer programs that the government in the United States uses, and why these young men who were trying to figure out these systems couldn't figure them out. It is because they didn't know COBOL, the common business oriented language that they were programmed in. That language was created by a woman, Admiral Grace Hopper. Admiral Hopper created something that we are still using in most banking and finance. So the Girl Scouts teaches this to young women, and they teach about these women who were pioneers at IBM, in the military, like Admiral Hopper, at NASA, like Captain Jameson. And the girls need that, and they're young, so their brains soak this up. And the Girl Scouts, I think the reason I'm so happy with that is the Girl Scouts have done also a remarkable job embracing physical disability, neurological disability. They are multicultural. So they bring in girls from all kinds of backgrounds, all different religions, different statuses. Um, and I just really admire that. And I look at that and I think to myself, why can't our classrooms be like that? Why can't our classrooms have, the posters of the greats in science and, wow, let's talk about this really cool, person who did this neat thing. Um, I don't know. To me, learning is all about celebrating the possible. And when we give role models, I know it sounds cliche, but people need to see people like themselves succeed. And when you see other people succeed, whether it's a young girl seeing a female, pilot the space shuttle, or it's a young man seeing someone with his immigrant background in an important role in government or in science. Um, One thing that I found really interesting was a study where they showed young men pictures of people who looked like themselves. So, they might show a Barack Obama to a young black student, or they might show a Gandhi to an Indian American, and then they gave them PSAT test, which is it's a standardized academic test. The PSAT is sort of the pre-test. Their scores went up. And we think, oh, well, role models aren't that important, but they are because what they say is you can do this too. You can do it. Get all the negativity, look at the positive, see what's possible. Imagine yourself in that role, that positive thing. Envision where you want to be, and that's how you get there.
I can't top this. Thank you so much, Christopher. This is the most hopeful message I think we could deliver today, and I thank you for that.
And I do want to add something that kind of to touch on what you are focused on as well.
Mm.
My daughters have anxiety. They have trouble sleeping. They have all of these things. And knowing there are tools out there, and one of the things that we have found is when their brains are engaged, they actually relax. When they work their brains, they are training those brains to be more elastic, to cope with anxiety, to cope with stress, to sleep better, to be more alert when they need to be alert. Our brains, even at my age, I hope that my brain is still somewhat elastic. And I think when we give up on ourselves, when we say, I can't learn anymore, I can't do new things, I can't change who I am, I can't
I
change my
can't teach another
personality.
way.
Yeah, there you go. That's giving up, and that's the wrong approach. Always envision yourself doing so much better.
Because you can do it too.
Absolutely.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you so much, Christopher. Everybody listening, have a blessed week.
Thank you.